The first thing you hear is the roar of an M60 opening up in the jungle. You feel the ground shake as the gun spits fire through the trees, and for a moment it sounds like the only thing keeping your squad alive. But the gunner is not cheering. He is praying the weapon does not jam, tear a cartridge rim, or break apart deep inside its stamped frame. This is the heart of the story you are about to hear. The M60 carried incredible firepower that terrified enemies and saved countless Americans, yet the same weapon could betray its operator at the worst possible second. By the end, you will understand why soldiers loved it, why they hated it, and why the United States finally walked away from the gun that defined a generation of war. After the Second World War ended, American planners sat down to review what they had learned from years of brutal fighting. One lesson stood out. German infantry units fought with a single family of weapons that could fill almost every battlefield role. The MG-34 and the MG-42 delivered steady fire from light bipods, heavy tripods, vehicles, and even aircraft mounts. German squads moved like small machine gun teams, with rifles supporting the gun instead of the other way around. The American Army had nothing like this. Their units carried a confusing mix of calibers and weapon types. An officer with a Thompson, two riflemen with Garans, someone with an M1 carbine, another with a bar, and a team dragging an M1919. It was a nightmare for supply teams, who had to send the right ammunition to the right soldier across wide, shifting fronts. Planners agreed that this chaos could not continue into a new era of conflict. During those first tense years of the Cold War, the United States wanted a weapon that could match the German concept. Engineers studied captured MG-42s and noticed two things right away. The feeding system was fast and smooth, and the barrel could be changed in seconds to keep the weapon alive in long fights. They also examined the German FG-42 paratrooper rifle. It had a comfortable pistol grip, efficient balance, and clever internal mechanics. American designers began taking pieces of both systems and blending them into something they hoped would become a universal machine gun. They wanted one weapon that could replace the aging bar, the M1919, and the old water-cooled M1917. One gun for one squad with one caliber for every role. Development was not simple. Teams tested prototypes through the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, looking for the right mix of weight, firepower, and durability. They adopted a gas operating system that fired from an open bolt, paired it with a disintegrating link belt, and added a quick barrel change system inspired by the MG-42. On paper, this new weapon seemed perfect. It was lighter than the M1919 by almost 10 pounds, which felt like a miracle to anyone who had carried that older steel box across Europe or the Pacific. It was compact enough for patrols but strong enough to sit on a tripod for defensive fire. It fired the new NATO standard round, the 7.62 by 51. That decision came from an agreement that alliance members did not need the same machine gun, but they should at least share the same ammunition so they could support each other in a future war. By 1956, American officials believed they had done it. The weapon was approved for service and then standardized the following year. Soldiers began calling it the M60. Some also gave it a more colorful name, the Pig, a nickname that would follow it from training camps to foreign battlefields. At first, troops saw it simply as a modern replacement. They learned how to load belts, adjust the gas system, clean the internals, and swap hot barrels. They practiced setting the gun on bipods for fast, flexible fire and on tripods for heavy, sustained fire. In training, the M60 looked strong and reliable. It fed smoothly. It produced a deep and steady rhythm. Instructors praised it as the centerpiece of the new infantry squad. Behind the scenes, however, small problems were already appearing. Test ranges reported a major stoppage roughly every 2,000 rounds, but the issue seemed manageable at the time. Many believed these were early production quirks that would disappear once manufacturing improved. Few imagined that these small signs would later become the source of countless battlefield frustrations. The focus was not on long-term wear or environmental stress. The focus was on firepower, and in that category, the M60 delivered. It could shoot 600 rounds per minute, fast enough to dominate an open field and slow enough to avoid burning through belts too quickly. Instructors told soldiers that 10 rounds per second was more than enough to break an ambush or crush a charging enemy. The weapon entered service at a moment when American forces prepared for a possible war in Europe. Units trained to defend open plains, river crossings, and dense forests. The M60 was supposed to anchor each squad, just like the MG-42 had anchored German squads 2 decades earlier. Everyone expected the first real test to come somewhere in Germany during a sudden clash with Soviet armored units. No one thought the M60 would instead meet its first enemy in thick rainforests, narrow trails, and dripping humidity on the other side of the world. By the early 1960s, American involvement in Vietnam was growing. Small advisory teams turned into larger formations. Helicopters, armored personnel carriers, and infantry units moved deeper into the jungle. The M60 followed them. The weapon that had been built for European fields was now about to face mud, heat, insects, vines, and constant monsoon rain. Soldiers did not know it yet, but Vietnam would reveal the true limits of the gun they had spent years preparing to trust. The M60 would show moments of incredible strength and moments of dangerous weakness, and the men who carried it would soon form a complicated relationship with the weapon meant to redefine American firepower. When the M60 finally reached Vietnam in the early 1960s, American forces were stepping into a landscape unlike anything the designers of the weapon had imagined. The jungle swallowed sound, blocked sight, and punished equipment with constant moisture. Trails cut through tall grass turned into narrow green tunnels. Heat rose like steam from the ground after every rain. In these conditions, the M60 quickly became the heart of every patrol. Soldiers trusted its heavier 7.62 rounds to punch through dense vegetation that easily slowed lighter bullets. The sound of the weapon echoed with a deep and steady rhythm that cut through the chaos of an ambush. For many squads, the first burst from the M60 meant survival. The weapon's presence changed how teams moved. Squads placed the machine gunner near the front, but not at the very point. Leaders wanted him close enough to react fast, but far enough that he would not walk into the first booby trap or hidden mine. His assistant stayed tight behind him to manage belts, guide ammunition, and watch the gun for early signs of trouble. A third man, often called the mule, carried extra belts, spare barrels, and whatever the gunner could not hold. That extra weight made his job one of the hardest in the squad, especially on long patrols through wet, uneven terrain. As patrols moved deeper into hostile areas, the M60's strengths became clear. When an ambush erupted from thick brush or tree lines, the gunner was trained to drop low, swing the barrel toward the muzzle flashes, and fire heavy bursts that forced the attackers to keep their heads down. The weapon's recoil was strong but manageable, allowing gunners to fire from the shoulder or even from the hip while advancing through tight jungle corridors. Many soldiers later said that during those first seconds of confusion, the M60 felt like the only thing pushing back the enemy. But this power came with a price. The enemy learned almost immediately that the machine gunner had to be eliminated first. Viet Cong fighters recognized the sound of the weapon, deeper and slower than the M16. They learned to look for the burst of dust that jumped from the ground each time the bipod dug in. They knew the M60's operator often stayed still to deliver accurate fire. This made the gunner the most dangerous threat in the squad and also the most obvious target. Several veterans recalled being told during training that their life expectancy after pulling the trigger in an ambush was measured in seconds. The number often repeated was 7. Whether or not this was precise, the idea stayed in everyone's mind. Once the machine gun opened up, the entire battlefield shifted to destroy that single weapon. This constant pressure shaped behavior. Officers and radio operators avoided standing near the machine gunner. Their survival was too important for communication and command. If the gunner drew rockets, grenades, or focused rifle fire, anyone beside him could also fall. The gunner learned to study his surroundings before every halt. He positioned himself behind small rises in the ground, thick roots, fallen logs, or large trees. Even with these precautions, he felt exposed. The enemy moved quietly and patiently. Any flash of movement could trigger an attack, and the first seconds after opening fire were always the most dangerous. Despite these dangers, many early combat reports praised the M60. Marine Corps units that still carried the older M1919 Browning noticed immediately how much easier the new gun was to maneuver. It no longer required a heavy tripod in every fight. It allowed quick shifts in direction and rapid bursts that could break enemy momentum. The ball ammunition kept its energy even after cutting through vines and branches. Enemy fighters, especially those relying on close ambush tactics, soon began avoiding positions where they knew American patrols carried a clear field of fire for a machine gun. Yet the longer American forces stayed in Vietnam, the more complex the relationship with the M60 became. Jungle humidity soaked ammunition belts. Mud and leaves clung to the links and were carried into the weapon's feed tray. Patrols often lasted several days, making it almost impossible to keep the ammunition clean. New soldiers sometimes wore belts draped across their chests because it looked impressive in photos, but after hours crawling through brush, those belts bent links and collected dirt that caused jams during firefights. Patrol leaders quickly banned this and told their men to store belts inside claymore bags or other sealed pouches. The weight of ammunition shaped daily routines. A single 100-round belt weighed about 7 pounds. A squad often carried several thousand rounds spread across the team. Every man usually held at least one extra belt for the gunner. The machine gun team carried far more. The cost of running out of ammunition during an ambush was too terrible to consider. Some units experimented with improvised feeding solutions. They placed belts inside empty ration tins or connected helicopter feed chutes to backpacks packed with hundreds of rounds. These setups allowed gunners to fire for long periods without reloading, which was both a great advantage and a clear risk. The more time the gun stayed active, the more attention it drew from enemy fighters. Through these early years, the M60 earned its reputation as the weapon that could both save a patrol and endanger the man behind it. Soldiers admired its firepower and trusted its ability to break enemy assaults. They respected how far its rounds could reach through dense brush. At the same time, they feared the attention it attracted and the strain it placed on their bodies. As the war pushed deeper into the late 1960s, the shine on the M60 began to fade. Soldiers still depended on its firepower, but they now understood that the weapon carried hidden dangers that could appear at the worst possible moment. In training, malfunctions seemed rare and manageable. In Vietnam, they arrived in the middle of thick jungle fights where seconds meant survival. Many veterans later said that the M60 could act like two different guns. One moment it was a lifesaver. The next moment it seemed determined to stop working altogether. The most feared problem was the runaway gun. It happened when the trigger parts wore down from heat, dirt, or heavy use. When the gunner released the trigger to stop firing, the bolt refused to stay back. The weapon kept shooting on its own until the belt ran dry or someone physically broke the link to stop the feed. In a safe environment, this was frightening. In a battlefield filled with moving friendlies and shifting targets, it could be deadly. A runaway gun jumped in the gunner's hands and walked upward as the barrel climbed. It wasted ammunition that had taken hours to carry through the jungle. Worse, it could sweep across friendly positions if the gunner did not brace himself in time. Assistants sometimes had to grab the belt with bare hands and twist until the metal links snapped apart. Another problem appeared with stuck cartridge cases. After long bursts, the heat inside the chamber rose sharply. When a round fired, the thin rim on the spent casing could tear off. The extractor had nothing left to grip. A broken rim left the empty casing stuck deep in the chamber. The only way to remove it was to push it out with a cleaning rod or pry it loose with a knife. In an ambush, there was no time to perform a delicate repair. Many gunners simply grabbed a spare barrel and swapped it, then tried to fix the jam once the fight ended. If the second barrel was already hot or damaged, the gunner was essentially out of action. The barrel release system caused its own troubles. Early M60s had a latch positioned in a way that allowed vines, branches, or even gear straps to snag it. Some soldiers discovered their barrel had fallen off only when they prepared to fire. Others opened fire and felt the barrel shift out of alignment, causing rounds to hit at strange angles or fail to leave the weapon at all. In the chaos of jungle movement, soldiers grew nervous about brushing against the latch. They learned to check it constantly, tapping the front of the weapon before patrols and after crawling through vegetation. Dirt was another enemy. Ammunition belts dragged through mud or sand carried debris into the feed tray. Belts that looked clean could still hide grit between the links. Once inside the weapon, this dust mixed with oil and created sludge that slowed the bolt. The feed pawls struggled to move stiff, dirty belts. Soldiers tried wiping their ammunition whenever they halted, but with monsoon rains and humid air, clean gear rarely stayed clean. A belt that had been submerged during a river crossing or dropped into a muddy trench could jam the gun on the very next burst. The M60 also had many stamped parts that bent or broke under stress. The pistol grip could crack. The bipod legs loosened after repeated firing. The carrying handle could fall off. Assistants often wrapped sections of the gun in wire or tape, hoping to keep parts from wobbling loose. Some units made it a ritual to check every screw and pin before bed, tightening whatever seemed slightly out of place. These small fixes kept the gun alive, but they also reminded soldiers that the M60 demanded constant attention. The darkest moments came when these problems collided during real battles. Ambushes happened quickly. A patrol moved through tall grass, and then bursts of fire erupted from hidden bunkers or tree lines. The gunner dropped into position, opened fire, and suddenly felt the weapon jerk into a runaway, or a casing ripped and the chamber locked, or a vine caught the latch and the barrel loosened. In those seconds, the squad felt exposed. They needed the M60 to break the ambush. Without it, they had to rely on rifles alone, which were often not enough to turn back a determined attack. These failures also created emotional pressure. The gunner carried the responsibility of being the squad's main firepower. Everyone relied on him. When the gun failed, some gunners felt they had put the entire team at risk. Others grew angry at the weapon, calling it unreliable or unpredictable. There were stories of soldiers throwing malfunctioning parts into rivers out of frustration. At the same time, no one doubted the weapon's potential. When it worked, it controlled the battlefield. When it failed, it created fear. Despite the problems, soldiers refused to give up. They adapted. They cleaned the gun more often, even during short halts. They cut strips of cloth to wrap hot barrels. They shaped wire to reinforce weak sections and built small guides to help belts feed smoothly. They learned to listen to the sound of the gun. A slight change in rhythm meant an overheating barrel or a gas system that needed adjustment. Experienced gunners could sense trouble before it became a full failure. By the end of the 1960s, the pattern was clear. The M60 could deliver outstanding firepower when conditions were controlled, but Vietnam was never controlled. Heat, mud, moisture, and constant movement exposed the design's weaknesses over and over again. The love for the weapon's raw power now mixed with frustration at its behavior. Soldiers who carried it every day understood that the gun demanded everything from them. As the war dragged into the late 1960s, soldiers understood that the M60 demanded not only strength but also creativity. The weapon could fire with terrifying power, yet it always seemed one step away from a malfunction. Gunners and assistants learned that surviving Vietnam meant turning the machine gun into something tougher than what came out of the factory. Every patrol brought new problems and new solutions. Some fixes were simple, others were wild. All of them came from the same thought. If the gun failed, the squad might not make it out. The first challenge was the ammunition. Belts could not be allowed to drag across the jungle floor. Each link was a risk. Mud filled the gaps between rounds and jammed the feed tray. Soldiers began storing belts inside claymore bags because the bags were light, easy to carry, and sealed well. Some cut old ration boxes into liners for the bags so the belts stayed even cleaner. Others placed 100-round belts into empty C-ration tins and wired the tin under the feed tray. This created a small guide that kept the first belt steady during movement and prevented it from twisting or bending when the gunner opened fire. For longer missions, soldiers built their own feeding systems. Some took radio backpacks and loaded them with several belts linked together. Then, they connected a flexible metal chute taken from downed helicopters to guide the ammunition straight into the M60. This turned one man into a walking fire platform. The gunner could shoot for long bursts without stopping to reload. The setup was heavy and awkward, but it changed how small units fought. On recon teams, this meant the difference between surviving an ambush and being overwhelmed. The long-range reconnaissance patrols, or LRRPs, took modifications even further. These small teams operated deep behind enemy lines, where they rarely had support. They needed a machine gun that could create shock, noise, and confusion during break contact drills. So they cut off the buttstock of the M60 and shortened the barrel. This created a weapon that looked half-finished and felt dangerous to use, but when fired, it produced a thunderous flash and blast. During sudden encounters, the gunner would stand, turn in a full circle, and fire in all directions. The bright flame and roaring sound made the enemy believe they were facing a much larger force. The team used those seconds of surprise to disappear into the trees. Even with these adaptations, the biggest struggle remained the barrel. The M60 fired from an open bolt, which helped keep the gun cool, but long bursts still pushed the barrel into extreme heat. Manuals instructed that during sustained fire, the barrel must be changed every 10 minutes or after 400 to 600 rounds. This rule seemed reasonable on a clean training range. In Vietnam, it bordered on impossible. Ambushes did not follow schedules. Patrols rarely had the time or space to pause and make careful adjustments. When the barrel overheated, the firing sound changed. It became sharper, faster, and more unstable. Gunners described it as a warning tone. When they heard it, they knew it was almost too late. If they continued firing, rounds could cook off inside the chamber without the trigger being pulled. At that moment, they had to perform a barrel swap while being shot at. There was no handle on the early versions. The gunner had to unlock the latch, twist the blazing metal forward, and pull it out with a rag or a piece of asbestos cloth. Many dropped the hot barrel because their gloves burned through instantly. Assistants hurried to pass the spare barrel, which often rolled in the dirt or landed in grass that burst into flame from the heat. The process was frantic, noisy, and painful. Severe burns became common among machine gun crews. Some men carried scars on their hands, wrists, and forearms for the rest of their lives. Yet they accepted it because the alternative was far worse. An overheated barrel that failed during a fight left the squad without its strongest weapon. Some units taped a piece of coat hanger wire to the front shroud to help lift the barrel faster. Others wrapped cloth around the barrel, despite the risk of it catching fire. Gunners eventually learned to change barrels by instinct alone, reacting to the changing tone of the weapon rather than waiting for smoke or malfunction. The rest of the machine gun also needed reinforcement. The pistol grip on many early models cracked easily. Soldiers wrapped it tightly with wire and tape to prevent it from splitting during recoil. The bipod legs loosened with constant firing. Some crews hammered the pins flat. Others tied the legs with cord to keep them from collapsing. The feed tray cover sometimes bent under pressure, so soldiers added pieces of metal or shaped hooks to keep it stable. Over time, these field hacks created an unofficial culture around the M60. The gun did not work well unless the squad made it work. It responded to care, attention, and constant adjustment. Gunners carried small toolkits with tape, pliers, cleaning rods, and spare pins. Assistants learned to watch the weapon's rhythm, to feel when belts pulled too tightly, and to spot when the gas system needed cleaning. The machine gunner and assistant, working as one, could keep the weapon alive even in the worst conditions. They trusted each other more than the weapon itself. Yet these solutions also highlighted a deeper truth. Soldiers were doing the work that the design should have done. The field modifications kept the M60 running, but they also showed how many weaknesses the weapon carried into battle. Every extra wire, every handmade part, and every burned hand revealed the strain behind the firepower. By the late 1960s, the M60 had reached a strange place in the minds of American soldiers. It was still the squad's strongest weapon, the tool that could break an ambush and push back overwhelming fire. Yet every patrol also reminded them that the machine gun was wearing down faster than the war itself. The early enthusiasm that surrounded the weapon in its first months in Vietnam had faded. Now, many gunners felt that they were carrying a machine that aged years with every mission. Each burst added stress. Each firefight left a new weakness. The weapon had raw power, but it was never built to survive the constant punishment of a jungle war. The stamped receiver was the clearest problem. It lacked the long-term strength of a fully milled steel body. After thousands of rounds, the metal began to stretch and flex. Small cracks appeared around the trunnion where the barrel locked into place. Feed trays warped from repeated heat cycles. Screws loosened themselves through vibration. Soldiers tightened them before every patrol, yet some still fell out when the gun recoiled on full auto. In a traditional conflict with shorter engagements, these flaws might have remained hidden. In Vietnam, where the gun fired daily and sometimes hourly, everything showed. Gunners reported strange behavior as weapons aged. Some noticed the bolt dragging slightly each time it cycled. Others felt the recoil increasing as parts inside the gun shifted from wear. On older guns, the bipod legs wobbled, making the weapon harder to aim during long bursts. Assistants sometimes tried to brace the legs with sandbags or sticks, anything that kept the front end steady. But the deeper problem was inside. The body of the weapon no longer held its original shape. Heat, pressure, and rough terrain slowly twisted it. Even the gas system struggled. Carbon built up quickly, especially after long bursts or after firing ammunition stored in humid conditions. The adjustable gas plug allowed soldiers to increase the pressure and force the gun to cycle harder, but doing this also increased stress on the internal parts. Gunners compared the choice to pushing a tired engine by pressing harder on the accelerator. It worked for a short time, then led to bigger failures. These issues did not stop at infantry squads. Vehicle crews also relied on the M60. Tanks and armored personnel carriers mounted the weapon for defense against infantry and ambushes. But dust and vibration inside armored vehicles wore the weapon even faster. The constant shaking loosened pins and cracked grips. Helicopter crews faced their own problems. Door gunners used the M60 in high winds and heavy vibrations. They fired long bursts at enemy positions during landings or extractions. The heat from these bursts often warped barrels faster than ground units expected. Some door gunners carried multiple spare barrels simply because they burned through them so often. The riverine forces faced challenges of their own. Boats patrolled narrow waterways where ambushes could erupt from both banks at once. Gunners stood exposed on the decks, firing the M60 at attackers hidden behind trees or in small bunkers. The constant moisture from river spray and monsoon rain soaked the weapon. Corrosion attacked anything not cleaned immediately. Metal wore down faster. Springs weakened. Pins rusted into place and became impossible to remove without force. Despite these difficulties, soldiers continued to rely on the weapon. They knew it might jam, but they also knew that when it worked, it changed the direction of a fight. Some units developed strict routines around maintenance. At night, while resting in defensive positions, gunners stripped the weapon completely. Assistants cleaned belts, checked links, and replaced weak ones. The work often continued by dim red light so enemy patrols would not see them. Even with these efforts, there were limits to what cleaning could fix. The core design simply could not withstand years of heavy use. By 1969, many older M60s had become unpredictable. One gun might run smoothly for hundreds of rounds. Another might jam on the third belt. Some weapons fired perfectly during training but failed under the first burst of real combat. The inconsistency created frustration and distrust. Gunners built relationships with their guns, learning each sound and vibration. They gave them names and personalities, sometimes joking about them, sometimes cursing them. They noticed when a gun seemed tired, when it kicked harder or cycled unevenly. A few even asked for new guns, only to receive weapons that were even more worn. The Army attempted to solve the problems with new variants. The M60E1 and later improvements strengthened certain parts and added features like better barrel handles. But these updated models arrived slowly, and many frontline units never received them. Supply lines were stretched. Repair facilities were overwhelmed with equipment from every branch. Most gunners simply kept using the same worn weapons because there were no replacements available. At the same time, a new contender was entering the conversation. The FN Mag, a Belgian-designed machine gun used by several NATO countries, demonstrated remarkable durability. The United States tested it and designated it as the M240. It was heavier than the M60, but far more reliable over long periods of fire. Its milled receiver could withstand tens of thousands of rounds without losing shape. Soldiers noticed immediately that the M240 felt like a stronger machine built for harsh combat. Still, the M60 remained in widespread use. Helicopters, patrol boats, and convoys depended on it every day. Gun trucks built by the Army Transportation Corps mounted several M60s at once, creating mobile fire platforms for dangerous roads. These trucks fought back against ambushes, with streams of tracers pouring from multiple guns. But even here, the M60 showed its limits. After long engagements, barrels glowed bright orange, receivers rattled, some guns broke down entirely in the middle of convoy fights. By the early 1970s, the message was clear. The M60 was powerful but fragile. It delivered force but demanded constant repair. It saved lives but also endangered the men who trusted it. The weapon had reached the edge of its potential. By the early 1970s, the United States military could no longer ignore the truth. The M60 had shaped the firefights of Vietnam, but it was reaching the end of what its design could handle. Every year of war pushed the weapon deeper into fatigue. Every patrol revealed new cracks and weaknesses. Soldiers respected its firepower, yet many no longer believed it could survive the demands of modern combat. The Army needed a machine gun that did not require constant field repairs, improvisation, and luck. They needed something that could keep firing without tearing itself apart. The comparison between the M60 and the FN MAG, now designated the M240, became impossible to overlook. The M240 used a milled receiver, heavy and solid, capable of absorbing tens of thousands of rounds without bending. Its internal parts fit tightly and stayed aligned even under extreme heat. It was heavier than the M60, but the weight came with reliability. When soldiers tested it, they found that the weapon cycled smoothly, resisted jams, and kept firing after long bursts that would have pushed the M60 past its limit. Commanders recognized that the M60's problems were not simple maintenance issues. They were structural issues built into the design. The stamped receiver lost rigidity. The feed system bent. The trigger group wore out too quickly. The gas system collected carbon faster than many units could clean it. These weaknesses forced the gunner to treat the weapon like a fragile tool, even though it was supposed to be the backbone of the squad's firepower. The experiences of helicopter crews made the situation even clearer. Door gunners depended on the M60 for protection during landings and medical evacuations. They fired long bursts that heated barrels until they glowed white. They watched parts crack under vibration. They carried multiple spare barrels, grips, springs, and even entire fire control groups. Some crews built racks of spare parts inside the aircraft because they knew something would fail during the mission. When these same crews tested the M240, they noticed immediately that the gun ran smoother and handled heat far better. Ground units reached the same conclusion. The more heavily a unit relied on the M60, the more they understood its limits. Convoy gun trucks often mounted 2 or 3 M60s together, but during long engagements, one gun almost always failed first. Patrol boats saw their weapons rust and loosen from constant moisture. Infantry gunners carried mountains of spare parts because they knew that something could break with every belt. Despite these problems, the M60 did not vanish overnight. It continued to serve in many roles because replacing a weapon across the entire military took time, money, and training. Special operations units kept modified versions for years because they understood how to maintain them and valued the weapon's controllable recoil. The machine gun also found a second life in helicopter and vehicle mounts, where weight mattered less. In Denmark and a few other countries, modernized versions like the M60 E6 still survive today. But the core lesson remained the same. The M60 was born from a blend of German wartime designs and fast post-war engineering. It carried impressive firepower, yet carried just as many flaws. Vietnam exposed these flaws by placing the weapon in endless heat, mud, and close combat. The machine gun simply was not built for that level of stress. For every soldier who said the M60 saved his life, another could describe how the weapon failed at a critical moment. The love came from its power. The hate came from the fear that it might not last long enough to deliver that power when it mattered most. When the M240 finally replaced the M60 in frontline service, it marked more than a simple equipment upgrade. It marked a shift in philosophy. The American military chose durability over lightness, strength over speed of production, and long-term reliability over short-term convenience. The M240 weighed more, but it demanded far less attention. It did not need homemade fixes, wire reinforcement, or desperate barrel swaps under fire. It could be trusted to work, even in the worst conditions. In the end, the story of the M60 became a story of contradiction. It earned a place in American culture through films and photos, always firing heroically in slow motion. But the real story came from the soldiers who carried it through swamps, rice paddies, and thick forests. They knew that the gun could give life or take it away depending on the moment. They respected it because they had to. They feared it because they understood its limits. And when the war finally ended, they were not surprised that the military moved on. The pig left behind a legacy of mixed memories, filled with the thunder of heavy fire and the sharp sting of burned hands. The weapon had power, history, and personality, but it also had a dark side. And that dark side, exposed in Vietnam's unforgiving jungle, is the reason the United States finally walked away.